I spent 12 hours cooking a 3-course Christmas dinner in the house I've owned for 30 years, only for my daughter-in-law to lean over the turkey and whisper 6 words that changed everything. "Maybe you should eat upstairs, Beverly." She didn't say it because there wasn't enough room. No. She said it because she had spent the last 14 months systematically erasing me from my own life, and she thought tonight was the night I'd finally disappear. She was wrong. Sasha delivered the line with a breezy, practiced calmness, the kind usually reserved for announcing the arrival of the afternoon mail. I stood there, paralyzed, a heavy serving platter weighing down my hands while steam from the roasted carrots billowed into my face. I was seconds away from claiming my rightful place at the head of the Christmas table. And then the audacity of her tone just sucked every bit of oxygen out of the room. Honestly, the day started so differently. Pre-dawn shadows were still clinging to the corners of the kitchen when I started my work at 4:30 that morning. 7 hours of leaning over a hot stove had left my feet throbbing inside my sensible shoes. My lower back was screaming in protest, yet the dining spread looked like a dream. The 20-pound turkey acted as the centerpiece, basted in its own juices since 6 a.m. until the skin reached a deep amber gold. That was the exact shade my late husband, Gerald, used to say looked airbrushed for a magazine cover. A slight tremor shook my fingers against the ceramic plate as I looked down. My reading glasses sat perched atop my head, likely smudged with flour and condensation, and my face felt hot and blotchy from the relentless radiation of the double ovens. The kitchen around me had become a beautiful, orchestrated disaster. Pie crust scraps lay scattered near a ring of softening butter I hadn't found a moment to wipe up. And the sink? The sink held a mountain of copper pots and battered wooden spoons. But, sitting right there, in the heart of the chaos, was my mother's blue glass bowl, brimming with cranberry sauce. The deep crimson gel cooled slowly, reflecting the harsh overhead lights. My mother brought that bowl out every December for 50 years, only stopping when her hands grew too stiff and shaky to carry it safely to the table. She passed it to me a decade ago, a quiet, fragile inheritance that felt significantly heavier than any piece of furniture. The whole house smelled of sage, toasted onion, and rich roasted stock. That thick, layered warmth doesn't merely hang in the air. It settles into the heavy velvet curtains and sinks deep into the hallway carpet. It's the kind of scent that transforms even the dark, cramped corner of the coat closet into a holiday sanctuary. At 63 years old, I stood in the house I had paid for, wearing an apron with a faded holly print that had become a domestic relic. Gerald originally bought it as a total joke from a local craft fair back in 2004, and I hadn't missed a single holiday wearing it since. The joke had long since morphed into a rigid tradition, the only thing I had to reach for in the silence of a dark kitchen before the sun rose. While some people reach for a steaming cup of coffee or a prayer book to anchor their day, I reached for that faded holly print and the vivid memory of the man who gave it to me. Sasha remained rooted in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed, tracking my movements with clinical detachment. She looked at the oven mitts tucked under my arm and the way my hair was desperately escaping its pins. "We didn't really plan this as your thing, Beverly," she added, her voice falling as flat and final as a slammed door. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable eating upstairs tonight. You know, where it's quiet." I gripped a damp dish towel until my knuckles went white. For a long, ringing moment, my lungs actually forgot how to draw air. Shock wasn't the primary emotion, not really. Deep in my gut, underneath all the soft, pathetic excuses I'd fed myself for months, I knew a moment of total eclipse was inevitable. I just hadn't wanted to watch it arrive in the middle of the day, wearing expensive lipstick and standing in front of a house full of expectant guests. 14 months ago, I would have laughed in the face of anyone suggesting my entire existence would narrow down to a single, cruel sentence whispered over simmering gravy. I am not naive. I buried my husband. I understand exactly how real hurt can hollow a person out from the inside. But I honestly believed I understood the architecture of the people I loved. I thought I knew where their edges were, and that basic human kindness would act like a railing to keep us all from tumbling over the cliff. I was dead wrong. If I'm going to tell this story properly, I have to go back to the roots. These things never ignite with a massive explosion or a screaming match in a kitchen full of holiday food. No. They begin in much smaller, quieter places. It's the phone call you answer with too much urgency. The small favor that secretly turns into a permanent arrangement. A chair moved 6 inches to the left that stays there. It's the tone of voice you ignore because you tell yourself they're just stressed. You swallow the silence whole because you don't want love to turn into a game of accounting. The sky was the color of wet concrete on a random Tuesday in March when the shift began. My son, Trevor, called me from the parking lot of his apartment complex. His voice cracking as he asked if he and Sasha could stay with me for a little while until they found their footing. I remember looking at the wedding photo on my mantle as we spoke. Trevor has his father's eyes, a specific shade of gray-green that can look incredibly soft in the light and strangely distant in the shadows. Even then, as I said yes, I felt a tiny prickle of unease. A shadow of the woman standing in my kitchen 14 months later. Gerald possessed those exact same eyes the first night we met at a community choir rehearsal in Grand Rapids when I was only 22. He was wearing a battered navy windbreaker and clutching sheet music in a cracked leather folder that smelled of cold air and cheap coffee. When he smiled at me, I felt my entire world tilt exactly 1 inch to the side, and it never quite tilted back. We spent 31 years married, and Trevor arrived 2 years into that journey. He was the kind of child who convinced you that parenting wasn't a chore, but a massive, undeserved privilege. Curious and observant. He was the type of boy who noticed if your hands were full and beat you to the door before you could even ask for help. Even as I reminisced about his childhood, I had to wonder, where did that boy go? And when did he start letting his wife treat his mother like a houseguest in her own home? At 9, he left me little notes on the kitchen island in careful, shaky block letters if he knew I had a doctor's appointment. Even at 15, the age where most boys turn into moody strangers, he was the kid who carried in every single grocery bag from the car without being prompted. Then came the pancreatic cancer. We received the diagnosis in October, and the disease took him by February. Those 4 months were simultaneously the longest and shortest weeks I've ever endured. Every single day felt stretched thin with the agony of waiting for the inevitable. Yet the time evaporated before I could process what was being ripped away. One Tuesday, Gerald was still sitting at the table making lists for spring garden projects. A few weeks later, he couldn't even manage to stand at the kitchen sink to pour a glass of water. The helpful advice started rolling in before the funeral flowers had even wilted. My neighbor, Doug, kept suggesting I downsize to a condo. My sister, Elaine, practically begged me to move closer to her in Ann Arbor so we could be widows together. A woman from my church told me with terrifyingly firm kindness that staying in a house full of memories was just a way of refusing to move forward, but I didn't see my home as a museum or a shrine. I saw it as the physical shape of my entire life. This was the colonial Gerald and I bought when Trevor was only 4 years old. I remember the uneven front walk and the way the massive maple tree in the yard turns a shade of orange that is almost offensively beautiful every October. This was the house where Gerald and his brother, Mike, spent an entire sweltering summer drinking light beer on the back deck, arguing over the price of crown molding while they renovated the kitchen. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought I was providing a sanctuary. What I didn't realize, and what I wouldn't find out until I found a hidden folder on Sasha's laptop 6 months later, was that their financial crisis wasn't the real reason they moved back home. There was a much darker clock ticking. The first few weeks with them in the house were actually quite lovely, or at least, that's the lie I told myself to keep the peace. Honestly, Trevor would stumble down early and make coffee, and we'd sit at the kitchen table in that quiet, blue morning light, just like we did when he was 16. Sasha would set up her laptop at the dining room table. She kept her papers stacked in terrifyingly neat piles, wearing her noise-canceling headphones and nodding through business calls. Takeout appeared once a week to give me a break, and she thanked me for every dinner I spent hours laboring over. Nothing felt ominous yet. I just thought we were in a standard period of adjustment. But then came the morning in early May when the throw pillows on my living room sofa moved. It sounds so petty to type out, the kind of thing people on Reddit mock. But those 4 cushions were the small anchors of my daily life. Two of them Gerald had haggled for at a market in Door County on our 25th anniversary, right before we got caught in a downpour. I'd sewn the other two myself, using a bolt of expensive fabric I bought downtown just before the local shop closed for good. I liked the way they caught the afternoon sun. But that morning, they'd been banished to an armchair in the corner. They were replaced by the patterned ones that were now centered stiffly on the sofa, looking like a real estate staging photo. My stomach did a little flip, a tiny warning bell I chose to ignore because I didn't want to be Times mother-in-law. I just moved them back, smoothed the fabric, and told myself Sasha was just trying to be helpful. That was my first real mistake, translating a blatant warning as a gesture of misplaced kindness. 2 weeks later, the warning grew louder. I walked into the hallway to find that Patricia's watercolor, the one she'd painted for me the year after Gerald died, was gone. It was a winter street scene, all soft grays and muted blues. The kind of art that feels like a long, quiet exhale. I found it leaning against a box of old boots in the coat closet. Its face was turned toward the wall like it was in timeout. In its place hung a massive abstract print with sharp black lines and dusty gray rows. It looked expensive. And it looked incredibly cold. I stood there staring at the empty space where my memory used to live, feeling a sharp, hot ache in my chest. When I went to Trevor, he wouldn't look me in the eye. "Sasha thought the hallway was a bit dark, Mom," he said, his voice flat and exhausted. "She's just trying to make the space feel more like home." That word home times hit the floor and shattered. This was my house. I had the deed in a safe upstairs to prove it. I told him, very evenly, that the painting stayed where it was. He nodded. But the abstract print hung there for 4 more days before Patricia's watercolor finally reappeared. I didn't make a scene because I told myself that 3 adults under one roof required adjustment. It's the word we use to dignify the fact that we're being walked all over. I thought I was being the bigger person. I didn't realize that in Sasha's mind, my silence wasn't grace. It was permission. By June, the erosion reached the kitchen. I went to make a cup of tea and couldn't find my favorite mug, the one Trevor had made for me in a pottery class when he was 12. It was lopsided. It was glazed in a blue that had pooled too dark near the handle, and it leaned slightly to the left. To anyone else, it was junk. To me, it was proof that my son's hands once made something beautiful for me. I found it shoved to the back of a high shelf, hidden behind a row of identical, sterile white mugs Sasha had bought. "It's just more functional this way," she told me with a bright, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The matching set looks cleaner. Yours is a bit uneven." It was taking up space. I told her it lived at the front. She just gave me that terrifyingly polite nod and said, "Of course, whatever you prefer." Whatever you prefer is the most dangerous sentence in the English language when spoken by someone who intends to do the exact opposite. By July, she came for the sewing room, my sanctuary. It was the only room in the house that was entirely mine, filled with my grandmother's old cabinet and fabric arranged by color on open shelves. It was the place I went when the grief got too loud and I needed the steady hum of a sewing machine to drown it out. I said no. I was plain, I was firm, and I didn't apologize. For a second, I saw the mask slip. I realized Sasha wasn't used to being told no by someone she considered a supporting character in her own life. "I completely understand," she said, still smiling. "No problem at all." 3 days later, I opened the door to my sanctuary and found 2 massive monitor screens bolted to my work table. My beautiful stacks of fabric had been unceremoniously shoved into plastic bins on the floor. My grandmother's sewing cabinet had been pushed into a corner to make room for a sleek, ergonomic office chair. I stood in the doorway, smelling the ozone of the electronics and the coldness of the takeover, and I felt something inside me go very, very still. I found Trevor in the garage. The air was thick with the smell of old motor oil and winter dampness. When I told him the sewing room was off limits, he looked at his shoes, shifting his weight like a guilty teenager. "She's just under so much pressure with the business, Mom," he said, his voice carrying a jagged, torn edge that made my heart ache and my blood boil simultaneously. He promised it was temporary. He said they discussed it, that he would talk to her. He did talk to her. She even offered a scripted, hollow apology that didn't reach her eyes. But the monitors? They stayed bolted to my work table for 6 more weeks, humming like a parasite. I'm not cataloging these grievances because I enjoy being the bitter mother-in-law. Honestly, I'm telling you this because this is how you lose your life, not in one grand explosion, but in 1,000 tiny surrenders. Nobody marches into your home on day 1 with a flag and a manifesto. If they did, you'd fight back. You'd call the cops or change the locks. Instead, the takeover happens in increments so small they feel embarrassing to mention. You don't want to be the crazy one over a moved rug or a hidden mug, so you swallow the bite. Before you know it, you aren't just defending a room. You're defending your right to remain a visible person inside the walls you paid for. I thought I knew where the bottom was. I thought once the sewing room situation settled, things would stabilize. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. By September, 6 months into a stay that was originally framed as a 90-day favor, the very air in the house had shifted. Honestly, it was heavy. Trevor had secured a new contract, and while they weren't exactly swimming in cash, the financial crisis had clearly evaporated. Yet, the silence on the topic of moving was absolute. There was no talk of leases, no apartment hunting, and definitely no thank you for everything. We found a place. Sasha had effectively stopped living in the house and started managing it like a corporate subsidiary. I'd return from the grocery store just to find a new kitchen rug she'd bought without a word. Or I'd find my bathroom soap dispensers replaced with matte black ones, because my florals didn't fit the aesthetic. I even caught her leaning over the fence, talking to my neighbor Doug about property lines, as if she were the one who'd be paying the property taxes for the next 20 years. And then there was the way she talked. She started using this chilling corporate speak in the hallway, standing in the kitchen I've cooked in for 3 decades, telling me we should really streamline this area to improve the flow. Trevor, my sweet, gray-eyed boy who used to be so intuitive. He just went silent. When he did speak, it was the voice of a man desperately trying to prevent a storm from breaking. He didn't realize his mother was already drowning in the rain. Look, there is a massive difference between keeping the peace and protecting what is right. Peace, in that house, had become a polite word for my disappearance. In October, the weight of it became too much. I sat at the kitchen table, the one with the scratch from Trevor's hockey bag back in '97, and I wrote a letter to Gerald. I told him I missed the way he used to take up space. I told him I felt like I was negotiating for oxygen in my own living room. After I finished, I folded the paper and tucked it into an old recipe tin, the one where I keep the things too heavy to throw away. Sitting there in the dark, a cold clarity finally took root. I had been asking for permission times to exist in my own home. I was using words like, if you don't mind and I'd prefer. Those aren't boundaries. They're wishes. And wishes are easy to ignore when someone else is benefiting from your hesitation. So, in November, I staged a formal intervention at that same kitchen table. I had my points written down on a legal pad because I knew my heart would try to betray my head. I told them the sewing room was being cleared out. Immediately. I told them all structural or decor changes had to be cleared through me. But most importantly, I told them I needed an end date. A hard move-out deadline of February 1st. Sasha sat there with her hands folded, wearing that I'm listening to a difficult child expression that people use when they want to look reasonable for the record. She nodded. She smiled. Of course, Beverly. We appreciate you, she said. Her voice was like silk over a blade. Trevor looked like he'd just been granted a stay of execution. But as the days ticked by, nothing actually moved. The monitors came out of the sewing room, sure, but they were replaced by a cold, simmering resentment that made the hallway feel 10 degrees colder. There was no apartment hunting, no brochures on the counter, no shift in the temporary status of their occupation. And then came the announcement of the Christmas party. Sasha informed me she didn't ask. She informed me that she was hosting a gathering on December 23rd for her sister Pam and some business associates. I'll handle everything, she said, with a tilt of her head that suggested I was too frail to manage a grocery list. You don't need to worry about a thing. I felt a thread of heat genuine anger flicker in my chest. It's my house, Sasha, I said. Any gathering here involves me. She pivoted instantly to the "I'm just trying to take the pressure off you" defense. It's a classic move, framing an insult as an act of service. I let it go because I was exhausted. And because a small, foolish part of me still hoped we could reach the finish line without a total collapse. On December 22nd, the day before the party, I walked into the dining room and stopped cold. My walnut chairs, which I'd bought one by one over 20 years like a slow-motion victory, had been shoved aside for folding chairs. The table had been dragged to the center of the room. My sideboard, holding Gerald's mother's china, was buried under a row of white pillar candles and some minimalist branches that looked like they belonged in a hotel lobby. But it was the floor that broke me. My Christmas centerpiece, the pine boughs and the little brass reindeer Gerald bought me in '94, was sitting on a pile of old newspapers on the rug. It looked like trash waiting to be taken out. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply walked over, picked up my reindeer, and put them back in the center of the table where they belonged. I moved her ambition candles to the sideboard and went to make coffee. Sasha looked at those reindeer like they were a personal insult when she walked in 10 minutes later. She didn't say anything then. But as she walked away, she made a phone call in the hallway. I only caught 3 words. It's happening tomorrow. At the time, I thought she was talking about the catering. Honestly, I had no idea she was planning a final move that would make the seating arrangement look like child's play. The next morning, December 23rd, I woke before the winter sun even considered rising. Honestly, it's the only time the house still feels like mine. My thick wool socks padded silently across the floor as I made my way to the kitchen. The rhythmic hiss of the coffee maker, the chill of the linoleum, the smell of softening butter on the counter. It was the only peaceful time I had left. By 2 p.m., the windows were fogged thick with steam, and the house smelled like rosemary, toasted pecans, and heritage. I had polished every glass until it sang and laid out the embroidered placemats I'd stitched myself back in '98 during the winter. Gerald's mother was so ill, I felt like a queen in a besieged castle. But a queen nonetheless. The guests arrived at 6. There was Pam, her husband Greg, and 2 polished women from Sasha's professional circle. I played the hostess. I took their coats, I pointed them toward the lit tree. I was in the kitchen, checking the gravy one last time, when Sasha appeared in the doorway. She didn't even look at the food. She just looked at my flushed face, my holly apron, my smeared glasses. And then she said it. We didn't really plan this as your thing, Beverly. Maybe you'd be more comfortable eating upstairs tonight. I want to describe this moment with surgical precision, because people usually expect a cinematic explosion of rage. They want the screaming, the thrown wine, the dramatic exit, but what I felt, it was something much colder and terrifyingly cleaner than anger. It was the sensation of a heavy fog finally lifting off a mountain road, revealing that I had been driving inches away from a 1,000-foot drop-off for months. Every polite suggestion Sasha had made, every accidental move of my furniture, and every time I'd chosen grace over conflict, it all snapped into a new, hideous shape. The audacity was breathtaking. This wasn't a case of 2 generations failing to communicate. No. It was a woman standing in my kitchen, a room that currently smelled of the 12 hours of labor I'd poured into it, telling me to vanish. Why? Because she had mistaken my kindness for a surrender of my own identity. I reached behind my back, untied the strings of my holly apron, and folded it, with the kind of slow, methodical focus you'd use for a flag at a funeral. I laid it on the granite counter right next to the silver gravy boat, smoothing out the wrinkles. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I walked out of that kitchen. But I didn't head for the stairs like a scolded dog. I walked straight into the dining room, where the air hummed with the nervous energy of guests who had definitely heard the exchange. The candlelight caught the crystal glasses, making tiny prisms dance across the walnut table. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table. My chair. The seat where I had sat every single Christmas since the year Gerald's chair went empty. Before that, Gerald had always sat at the opposite end, carving the bird with an exaggerated ceremony that would make a king look humble. He used to narrate his carving like a play-by-play sportscaster, using a deep, booming voice that echoed off the crown molding. I could almost hear the ghost of his laugh as I remembered the Thanksgiving in 2011 when he made Trevor laugh so hard that milk actually came out of his nose. Gerald had retold that story every year, until his voice finally gave out. I sat down, and honestly, the room didn't just go quiet, it went into a state of suspended animation. It wasn't a staged movie silence. It was that raw, heavy pause that occurs when someone claims their space with a certainty that makes questions feel illegal. I could feel Sasha's presence in the doorway behind me, a static charge of disbelief and fury. I didn't give her the satisfaction of turning around. Instead, I picked up my napkin and smoothed it over my lap, my eyes locking onto Sasha's sister, Pam. Pam. "It is so wonderful to have you back in this house," I said. My voice was warm and resonant. "Trevor mentioned you've been redoing the front beds. How is the landscaping coming along?" Pam blinked. Her eyes darted toward Sasha for a fraction of a second, before the sheer normalcy of my question gave her a lifeline. She exhaled a visible wave of relief washing over her face as she realized I was offering her a way out of the awkwardness. Greg let out a hearty laugh that broke the last of the tension, and the conversation began to move. That is one of the quietest, most lethal forms of power a woman of my age possesses, the ability to steer a room exactly where you want it to go. I answered every question with poise. I asked about their lives with sincere interest. I smiled, where it was appropriate. I never raised my pitch. I never looked flustered. And I absolutely never offered a single word of explanation for why I was sitting at the head of my own table. Eventually, the silence from the doorway broke as Sasha finally walked over and took a seat. Her face was a mask of rigid, polite stone. The dinner proceeded exactly as a holiday meal should. Greg went back for thirds, Pam begged for the pie recipe, and the guests were genuinely charmed. Trevor barely spoke a word, his eyes fixed on his plate, while Sasha spoke with a brittle brightness for 20 minutes before fading into a brooding silence. But the only silence that truly mattered was the invisible boundary that had just been carved into the floorboards. The silence. It was finally broken when the guests filtered out into the freezing Michigan night. Honestly, I didn't waste a single second. I went straight to the kitchen. And I started the dishes. Yeah, the dishes. Because let me tell you, there is something medicinal about the ritual of reclaiming your space, one plate at a time. The rhythmic splash of the water, the soft clink of Gerald's mother's silver against the basin. It acted as the soundtrack to my life returning to its proper sequence. I was drying the last platter when Trevor walked in. He looked smaller than I remembered him. His shoulders were hunched, as if he were trying to occupy as little space as possible. "Mom," he started. His voice was actually cracking. "I had no idea she was going to say that to you. I am so incredibly sorry." I looked at him, and I saw the brace. It's that look some men get when they've spent months living in a house where the emotional floorboards are constantly shifting. "Trevor," I said. I kept my voice soft, but unyielding as granite. "I have been patient. I have made room for you both in ways I will never regret. But I cannot keep making room if what you fill it with is disregard for the woman who built this life." The silence that followed was heavy. It was punctuated only by the distant sound of a car passing by with its radio playing Christmas carols. Trevor just looked at his hands. His knuckles were white. "I know we've overstayed," he said finally. I think I've been hiding here because staying was easier than figuring out what Sasha and I are actually doing." Honestly, that was the most truth he'd spoken in a year. My house hadn't been a sanctuary for them. It had been a shock absorber for a marriage that didn't want to face its own cracks. My cooking, my patience, they had been the cushion they used to postpone their own hard truths. "I love you, Trevor," I told him. "But I am not a holding pattern for someone else's unresolved life. You and Sasha need to find your own front door by February 1st. I'll help you find a place. I'll even cover the first and last month's rent. But February 1st? That is the day. He nodded slowly. And for the first time since March, the tension in his face actually seemed to break. He didn't argue. He looked relieved. The weeks that followed were quieter than I ever expected. Though quiet is a loaded word here. It was that pressurized stillness. The kind that comes right after a massive storm has blown through and you're finally stepping outside to count the downed power lines. Trevor spent his evenings hunched over a laptop at the kitchen table. His eyes were bloodshot as he scrolled through Zillow listings while the scent of burnt coffee lingered in the air. Upstairs, the house hummed with the sound of tense, closed-door conversations. I couldn't hear the words, but I could feel the vibration of their conflict in the hallway. Some days, Sasha was a ghost. She'd slide past me with nothing but a clipped sentence about the mail. Other days, she was aggressively cordial, overperforming the role of the perfect houseguest, as if she could scrub away the memory of that Christmas dinner. But the spell? It was finally broken. Once a truth becomes visible, once you realize someone has been measuring the drapes in a house that isn't theirs, it rarely agrees to go back into hiding. They eventually found a 2-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes away. The atmosphere shifted from a siege to a countdown. On January 28th, 3 days before my deadline, the rented van appeared in the driveway again. I stood on the front porch with my winter coat buttoned to my chin. I watched them load the last of the boxes. Trevor walked up the porch steps one last time and wrapped his arms around me. He held on much longer than usual. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered into my hair. I kissed his cold cheek and told him to take care of himself. Really, take care of himself. Sasha followed. She offered a brief, stiff hug that lasted exactly 1 second. Her perfume was cool, expensive, and entirely out of place against the smell of wood smoke and winter. "We'll be in touch," she said. Her eyes were already darting toward the idling van. I watched them drive away until the taillights turned the corner and vanished, leaving the street in a sudden, ringing silence. Then, I went back inside. The silence that met me wasn't empty or lonely. It was physical, it was heavy, and it was completely restored. I stood in the hallway for a long time, just looking at Patricia's watercolor. I reached up and moved it exactly half an inch higher on its nail. It had always hung just slightly crooked, a tiny imperfection I'd noticed for years, but never felt I had the right to fix while the house was under occupation. I walked into the kitchen. My footsteps echoed on the tile. I reached into the back of the high cupboard and I pulled out Trevor's handmade, lopsided blue mug. I placed it right at the front of the shelf, where it belonged. Then, I pushed open the door to the sewing room. I stood there, just breathing in the scent of aged fabric and old wood. My grandmother's sewing cabinet was still pushed sideways at a pathetic angle. I put my weight into it and shoved it back into its rightful place against the far wall. There is a specific, sacred kind of healing that happens when you put familiar objects back where they go with your own hands. It's not that the objects are everything. It's that they are the silent witnesses to whether or not you are still allowed to decide the shape of your own days. That evening, I pulled every bolt of fabric out of the plastic bins. I returned them to the shelves, sorting them by color: navy beside slate, cream beside oatmeal, and a soft pale blue tucked right next to a faded indigo. I sat down at my work table, finally clear of those buzzing monitors, and I started cutting the first pieces for a quilt I'd been planning for nearly a year. Blue and cream. A flying geese pattern. Trevor calls me twice a week now. Without the daily static of avoidance, he sounds more like the man I raised. He's softer, clearer, and less braced for impact. A few weeks ago, he told me that he and Sasha had started seeing a marriage counselor. I thought that showed a tremendous amount of courage, but I didn't pry. Their marriage is their work to do. I spent far too many months serving as the human insulation for a conflict that didn't belong to me. In February, I received a text from Sasha. It was short. She wrote that she knew things had been difficult and that she was sorry for the part she played. I sat with that message on my screen for an hour before I eventually wrote back, "Thank you for saying that. I wish you both well." I meant every word. Forgiveness doesn't require you to give someone a key to your back door again. Sometimes, forgiveness is simply the refusal to keep dragging old, jagged glass across your own palm. The flying geese quilt is nearly finished now. I work on it most evenings under the warm glow of my lamp. Sometimes with music playing. Sometimes in a silence so deep it feels like a prayer. I'm planning to give the quilt to Trevor and Sasha when I've put the final stitches in the binding. It isn't an apology. And it isn't a peace offering. It's just a quilt. A useful, warm thing made with care. But it was made in my room, in my house, and on my schedule. That is not a minor detail, that is the entire point. If there's a lesson to be found in all of this, it's that the moment someone fully crosses a boundary in your life almost never arrives without a warning. It is preceded by 100 tiny preparation steps you told yourself didn't matter. A pillow moved. A painting taken down. A room repurposed after you already said no. If you let those moments pass in silence because you're embarrassed to seem petty, the silence eventually becomes the loudest thing in the room. You are allowed to interrupt that silence. You are allowed to sit at the head of your own table and claim your space without performing guilt to make everyone else comfortable. Love doesn't require you to erase yourself. And your home? It is more than just an address. It is the physical shape of the life you have tended, and it is yours.